Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving into a chilling case where a woman had a feeling of doom and left clues for her to solve her murder. You know, even with all the fancy technology cops have now, some old crimes remain mysteries. But this one's different. There's a clear suspect, and the victim herself left hints before she died. Charlene Gandhi. She had a gut feeling something bad was gonna happen. She left clues for her daughters, hoping they could find the truth. The police arrested a guy, put him on trial, and he went to jail. But wait, there's more. The case was reviewed again and again, and the verdict kept changing. Life in prison, then freedom. Nearly 25 years later, the suspect's free, and Charlene's daughters are still searching for the truth. This is a twisted story, and we're about to unravel it together. Charlene Gandhi, a stunning beauty queen, was born in 1948. She was always the prettiest girl around, winning beauty contests since she was a kid. Everyone noticed her. But here's the twist. Charlene struggled with her mental health. She got married in 1970 and had 2 daughters, Tammy and Tiffany. Life seemed picture perfect, but something dark was lurking beneath the surface. The couple moved to Denver for her husband's job. He made good money, so Charlene could stay home and raise the kids. But things weren't always happy. As Charlene got older, her mental health got worse. She had wild mood swings, making it hard for her to take care of herself or the kids. Poor Tammy had to grow up fast, looking after her little sister. Her husband tried to help, urging her to see a therapist, but she refused. Things got so bad that he filed for divorce. The girls had to live apart, which was really tough. Tammy went to live with their dad, while Tiffany stayed with their mum. Years later, their dad got custody of both girls. They still saw their mum on holidays, but things weren't the same. In 1989, Charlene called her friend Tammy with exciting news. She had met her true love, a man named Ken Wakisaka. Despite knowing about her mental health struggles, Ken accepted her wholeheartedly. That same year, the two got married. At first, they lived in Ken's house in California, but Charlene had always dreamed of moving to Hawaii. Wanting to make her happy, Ken found a job in Honolulu and rented a cozy townhouse in a beautiful neighborhood. By the early 90s, they had settled in Hawaii and invited Charlene's daughters to visit. The girls liked Ken instantly. He seemed like a thoughtful and caring man who made their mother happy. Charlene, too, looked calm and content. For nearly 10 years, their marriage appeared strong and joyful. But appearances can be deceiving. Over the years, Charlene's daughters, Tammy and Tiffany, grew up and moved away. Tammy settled in California with her husband and children, while Tiffany started her career in Arizona after finishing university. They stayed in touch with their mother through regular phone calls and occasional visits to Hawaii. In 1998, during one of these calls, Charlene revealed something troubling. She and Ken were constantly arguing and on the brink of divorce. After that, her calls became more frequent and emotional. Her daughters could hear the sadness in her voice, often realizing she'd been crying. Concerned, they tried speaking with Ken, but he always insisted everything was fine and there was no need to worry. In autumn 1999, the sisters flew to Honolulu to visit their mother. During their stay in the townhouse, they noticed nothing unusual about Ken and Charlene's relationship. Everything seemed normal. But just before they left, Charlene made a chilling request. She made her daughters promise that if anything ever happened to her, they would investigate and uncover the truth. Her words left them uneasy. When they pressed her for answers, asking if she felt threatened or if something was wrong, Charlene gave vague responses and refused to explain. She only begged them to keep their promise. About a month after their visit, Charlene told her daughters she and Ken had separated. She moved back to their home in California to finalize the divorce, while Ken stayed in Hawaii. The news didn't shock Tammy and Tiffany. They saw it as an inevitable step toward their mother finding peace. Tammy, who lived nearby, invited Charlene to stay with her family for a while. Charlene seemed to enjoy the change. She spent time with her grandchildren and told Tammy she hadn't felt this happy in years. But then, unexpectedly, Charlene decided to return to California in a hurry, claiming urgent matters. After that, she vanished for nearly a week. When her daughters finally reached her, Charlene revealed she'd gone back to Hawaii, reconciled with Ken, and decided to stay with him. Tammy and Tiffany weren't surprised. This kind of sudden change wasn't unusual for their mother. But soon, something strange began to happen. Charlene started calling her daughters, sharing the same stories over and over within hours, completely unaware she'd already told them. At first, the sisters chalked it up to her mental health challenges, assuming she was simply mixing up which daughter she had called. The daughters had started ignoring some of their mother's calls, a choice they would soon deeply regret. On April 4th, 2000, Charlene left an eerie message on Tammy's answering machine. Her voice was unsettling as she said she loved her daughters and grandchildren, that she had found God, and now she could find peace. Terrified, Tammy immediately called back. Ken answered and said something strange was going on with Charlene, but he didn't know what to do. Tammy demanded to speak to her mother. When Charlene got on the line, Tammy was horrified. Her mother's speech was slurred, slow, and labored, as if every word was a struggle. She repeated that she loved her daughters, but Tammy couldn't understand much else. Fearing the worst, Tammy called emergency services and begged them to send help to Charlene's house. Meanwhile, Tiffany got in touch with their mother and stayed on the phone with her until the ambulance arrived. Hearing the sirens in the background, Tiffany breathed a sigh of relief, thinking her mother would finally get the help she needed. She and Tammy asked Ken to keep them updated once the medics assessed Charlene's condition. But this was just the beginning of a battle between life and death. When the doctors arrived, they examined Charlene but couldn't figure out what was wrong. She was conscious and calm but sluggish, speaking slowly and without emotion. Ken suggested that she might have taken some medication and washed it down with alcohol. However, the medics quickly dismissed this. Charlene didn't smell of alcohol, and there were no bottles or pill containers in sight. When asked to show where the medications were kept, Ken led them to the bathroom cabinet. Inside, the medics found no strong or psychotropic drugs, and all the bottles and packages appeared untouched. According to Ken, nothing was missing. The medics noted the names and quantities of the medications in their report and concluded that Charlene wasn't under the influence of drugs or alcohol. Despite her unusual condition, Ken refused to let Charlene go to the hospital. He insisted they could handle it themselves since her life didn't seem in immediate danger. The medics had no choice but to leave, but something didn't feel right. On the afternoon of April 5th, Charlene called Tiffany again, but her speech was so labored that they could barely talk. That night, Tiffany couldn't take it anymore. She called an ambulance and demanded that her mother be hospitalized. This time, Charlene was taken away, unconscious, and rushed to intensive care. Hours later, her condition worsened. She fell into a deep coma and was placed on life support. The next day, Ken called Tammy with grim news. Their mother was hovering between life and death. Tammy immediately informed Tiffany, and the sisters quickly flew to Honolulu to be by Charlene's side and uncover what had happened. While still at the airport, Tiffany called the police. She shared her suspicions, convinced that Ken might be involved in her mother's sudden decline. Though she had no evidence, Tiffany remembered her mother's plea and was determined to keep her promise to investigate. As soon as they arrived in Hawaii, the sisters rushed to the hospital. The doctor informed them that Charlene was still in a coma and reliant on life support. Ken, meanwhile, had returned home to rest. Something didn't sit right with them. The promise to their mother hung heavy in their mind's end. They knew they had to act fast. Ken's behavior left Tammy and Tiffany shocked and uneasy. They couldn't understand why he hadn't stayed at Charlene's side until they arrived from the airport. When the sisters reached the hospital, Ken was already there, looking distraught and lost. He said he planned to stay by Charlene's bedside while Tammy and Tiffany, exhausted from their long journey, went to their mother's home to rest. The sisters refused to stay in a hotel, insisting on staying at Charlene's house with Ken before they left. Ken handed them a sealed envelope labeled * childhood photos. He said Charlene wanted them to have these pictures, but the sisters had other plans. They didn't want a hotel because they intended to search the house and yard for any clues, and they needed to do it while Ken wasn't there. At the townhouse, their search inside revealed nothing suspicious. It seemed like Ken might have already cleaned up, but outside, in a flower bed, they found something, an empty pill bottle that looked like it had been discarded recently. Then Tammy remembered something. During a phone call, Charlene had mentioned childhood photos, hinting they would reveal answers. At the time, Tammy thought it was nonsense. But now, she grabbed the envelope Ken had given them and opened it. Inside were not childhood pictures, but pages from Ken's diary. Shockingly, the notes revealed that Ken had been attending anger management courses. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but what exactly had happened to their mother? As Tammy and Tiffany read Ken's diary, their hearts sank. Page after page detailed how he had humiliated and hurt Charlene. He wrote about calling her names, yelling at her, and even spitting on her. While there was no mention of physical violence, the emotional abuse was undeniable. It became clear to the sisters that Ken might have pushed their emotionally fragile mother to the breaking point, possibly driving her to attempt to take her own life. The diary, written in Ken's own hand, was significant evidence. Charlene's warnings that something might happen to her suddenly felt terrifyingly real. While Tammy and Tiffany searched for more evidence at the house, a police officer visited the hospital to question Ken. By then, it was confirmed that Charlene had taken a large dose of medication, which caused her to slip into a coma due to delayed medical attention. The sisters believed Ken might have been involved, but knew they lacked the solid evidence needed to confront him directly. Ken's demeanor during the police interview was calm, almost too calm. He claimed he had no idea when or how Charlene could have taken the pills. Then, unprompted, he emphasized that he hadn't touched or strangled her. This odd clarification raised eyebrows but wasn't immediately flagged as significant, since there were no visible signs of violence on Charlene's body. Another troubling revelation came to light. Ken had a history of legal trouble, including charges of assault and battery before he met Charlene, something he had kept hidden from her. The case was becoming more complex, and the sisters knew they needed to dig deeper to uncover the truth. The detective worked with Tammy to devise a plan to make Ken open up. They decided to record a phone call, asking him detailed questions about the events of April 4th. During the call, Ken spoke about how much he loved and missed Charlene. He claimed she must have taken pills that day and started saying goodbye to him, but he didn't realize the seriousness of her actions at first. Shockingly, he said Charlene had even asked him to strangle her to help her leave, but he insisted he didn't do it. When Tammy pressed him on why he hadn't called 911 immediately, Ken shrugged it off. He said he hadn't taken her words seriously, thinking she was just depressed. As the questions became more pointed, Ken's tone shifted. He suddenly became defensive, accusing the sisters of trying to frame him. His voice grew louder as he yelled, "I didn't beat her. I didn't strangle her. There were no marks on her body." For the third time that day, Ken brought up strangling and prompted. The sisters and the detective were left wondering, was his guilt starting to slip through his words? The next day, while Tammy and Tiffany flew back to California to gather more evidence from their mother's belongings, Ken made a shocking decision. Without their knowledge or consent, he authorized doctors to take Charlene off life support. The sisters were devastated. But what disturbed them even more was Ken's behavior at Charlene's funeral. His speech sounded less like a tribute to his wife and more like a calculated legal defense. Ken's repeated mentions of strangulation raised serious red flags. After Charlene's death, additional tests were conducted. The results were chilling. Charlene had suffered brain damage consistent with strangulation, and faint compression marks were found on her neck. It appeared the perpetrator had tried to avoid leaving visible evidence. The sisters handed over Ken's diary pages, the recorded phone call, and the autopsy results to the police. These pieces of evidence painted a damning picture. Adding to the suspicion, investigators discovered that shortly before Charlene's death, Ken had taken out a $150,000 life insurance policy on her. The motive for the crime seemed clear. Ken Wakasaka was arrested and charged with intentional deprivation of life. His trial began in the spring of 2002, 2 years after Charlene's tragic death. The proceedings lasted only 2 weeks. The evidence, the diary, the phone call, the insurance policy, and the autopsy was overwhelming. The 46-year-old was found guilty of second-degree deprivation of life and sentenced to life imprisonment. He would be eligible for parole after 30 years. For Tammy and Tiffany, the verdict brought some sense of justice. They had kept their promise to their mother and uncovered the truth behind her untimely death. It seemed justice had been served. Ken Wakasaka was behind bars, and Charlene's family could finally begin to heal. But 2 years later, the case took a shocking turn. A renowned civil rights attorney named John Edmonds, known for tackling controversial cases, became intrigued by Wakasaka's ambiguous conviction. Sensing an opportunity to boost his career, Edmonds decided to take on the case. Edmonds meticulously reviewed the case files, searching for flaws. He discovered a critical issue. During the trial, the prosecutor had highlighted Ken's decision not to testify, suggesting it was evidence of guilt. This, Edmonds argued, was a direct violation of the Fifth Amendment, which protects defendants from self-incrimination. Using this constitutional misstep as the basis for an appeal, Edmonds succeeded in getting the case reopened. When Tammy and Tiffany heard the news, they were initially unshaken. They believed the evidence against Ken, his diary, the phone call, and the autopsy results was too strong for any lawyer to overturn the conviction. But they underestimated the skill and determination of Edmonds, who was ready to challenge everything they had fought for. In 2004, the unthinkable happened. Ken Wakasaka's conviction was overturned, and he was released on bail. Although he wasn't acquitted, the legal battle was far from over. Soon after, a previously unheard witness emerged, a student who had rented a room in Ken and Charlene's apartment. He testified that Charlene had often spoken about death and on the fateful day had refused hospitalization when the medics arrived. According to the student, it was Charlene, not Ken, who had been determined to avoid help. Armed with this new testimony, Edmonds went to court, successfully convincing the judge to drop the charges of intentional deprivation of life against his client. Ken wasn't fully exonerated, but the case was crumbling. Tammy and Tiffany were furious when they heard the news. They demanded the case be reopened, sure that the evidence against Ken was irrefutable. However, they were met with a cold reality. The prosecutor who had originally handled the case had passed away, and his successor showed no urgency in pursuing the matter. Taking advantage of the delay, Edmonds consulted with a forensic expert who had access to Charlene's autopsy results. After reviewing the materials, the expert delivered a shocking conclusion. Charlene was likely not strangled at all. The marks on her neck, he suggested, could have been caused by the life support tubes that had been inserted into her throat during her time in the hospital. These tubes, left in 4 days after her disconnection, could have left marks that resembled strangulation. In 2010, the prosecutor dropped the original charge and reclassified Ken's case from intentional deprivation of life to criminal negligence, a far less severe charge. However, Edmonds quickly refuted this, and the case never made it to court. Years passed, and despite the sisters' relentless efforts, no further attempts were made to reopen the case. Nearly 25 years after Charlene's death, the investigation seemed to stall. Ken, aided by a brilliant lawyer, had successfully navigated the legal system, avoiding justice once again. Today, Tammy and Tiffany continue to believe in their mother's innocence, convinced that Ken was responsible for her death. Their investigation persists, though it feels like the final chapter may never be written. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe. There are many more shocking stories ahead.